Dr. Bruce Bradley. Welcome to Underground.
Good morning.
Good morning. Uh, Great to have you here. Underground features independently minded archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and science renegades on controversial topics and themes such as early complex culture, unexpected finds, ancient migrations, diffusion, and of course, ancient technology. And you are certainly an independently minded archaeologist, and I'm thrilled to have you here. I'm going to run through a quick bio that I've got for you, which is that you're an emeritus professor at University of Exeter. You are a research associate at the Smithsonian. You are associated with the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies. You are certified to teach in South American University. That's an interesting bullet point. Um, Certainly be something fun to explore in retirement, I might imagine. You studied at the University of Arizona and you have a PhD from Cambridge. Your early research was in North American Southwest in Great Plains, but you expanded into the Upper Paleolithic of Russia and France, and interestingly enough, have touched on horse domestication in Central Asia. I want to ask you about that. And you're
Sure.
actively involved, obviously, in the peopling of the Americas. Um, this is a great uh, privilege for me to speak with you. Big fan of your work, and I even published a paper 25 years ago in a Rutgers University student journal while I was a student at FSU that really touched on Upper Paleolithic maritime technology in Europe, kind of thinking about how it might play into your theory. I'm a Michael Fott student who, of course, is a Vance Haynes student. So I'm a kind of, we've got some connectivity there, I would
We
imagine,
do.
and big fan of Across Atlantic Ice. So, uh, I think part of the risk here of this conversation is that I really know this theory well. So we'll have to try and bring it to a level that a lot of people can relate to. And I'm just, yeah, really excited to have you. So thank you. What did I miss? I know you have a long and storied career, but fill us in a little bit.
Well, that's fine. The other thing I think you didn't get into is my ability at flint knapping. Uh, I'm very expert at making ancient stone tools, but not just making forms. The technology, how they are made, how they were made, and that feeds very very strongly into most of the research that I've done. So that's another aspect. Um, that I think is important to understand. So when I'm looking at stone tools, I'm not just looking at forms or this looks like that. I'm really diving deeply into details of what was going on in the minds of the makers.
Yeah. And that's a great point. Thank you. And for those out there in the world who aren't familiar with lithic technology and flint knapping, there's a real tremendous value to the experimental aspect of it, and really understanding not only how it was done, but what it took to do it. The fine motor skills required, and really the sophistication that was involved in executing a beautifully crafted stone tool. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. The other aspect that I've been quite involved with is actually the early development of human cognition as expressed in stone tools. So when you get back to the very very early times, 2 million years ago, a million years ago, where does language come from? How does it relate to the development of stone tool technology? And so I've worked with neurologists and physicists and all kinds of different people on this particular topic. Um, and it's turning out to be very, very interesting. A lot of other people have carried on with this work past what I was involved with, but it really there is a connection between the cognition of tool making and the development of language, for instance. So that's another aspect of things that I sort of bring to the issues that we're going to talk about.
I haven't heard that before. Do you want to take a minute and expand on that a little? What is the sort of the foundational premise between a cognition the development of a language. Between
Okay.
the development of language and stone tool production.
It gets into the neurology of the human brain, and this is not my part. I do most of the work that I research. I do is collaborative, and so working with some neurologists on this and other archaeologists that also have more neurology background. The thing comes into basically the area of the brain that lights up when you're doing speaking language is Broca's area, which is the same place that lights up when you're doing flint knapping, when you're making stone tools. And the neurologists are absolutely convinced that I worked with that there's a connection. It's a kind of a chicken and egg thing. Did production of stone tools, as it developed and got more complex, actually stimulate the brain to change, or was it the other way around? Did the brain change that allowed the cognition for the stone tool manufacturer as it got more complex? That's something that hasn't really been answered yet. But if you look online for anything and you put in human cognition language, you're going to find all kinds of scientific work. And it involves experimental archaeology, experimenting, making these things. And then I had a 2-year project that was funded, actually 3-year project that was funded, where I took a group of people and started them flint knapping, and we did MRIs. We were able to determine their learning process, et cetera, et cetera. And so the connection is still a very, very strong one. We have to remember that when we're looking back at early human development, we don't have much to go on. We've got a few fossils and we've got stone tools, and that's about it. And so everything that's sort of all the theories that come about how we developed, when language came in, when language got complex, is all related to the proxy of stone tools. So there's been a real strong connection there. I mean, we don't have the genetics from that time. So anyhow, it's been a real interesting thing, but it also, once you get modern human beings, we start to see that the cognition is pretty much the same from about 45,000, 50,000 years ago to present. Folks back then had about the same brain that we have now. So from then on, it's not quite as important, but when we're looking at how did we get our brain as it is, it's what we got to go with. So
interesting.
You can apply
it makes sense in the way that we must exercise our brain through life, and the process of flint knapping, I think, is very much doing that. It's almost working a puzzle, and working through a series of steps to get to a conclusion that is quite challenging to without breaking your tool in the process, without destroying the puzzle in the process, so to speak. So I can imagine where that sort of cognitive exercise could have its it could be interwoven into other forms of cognition like language. That's fascinating. Wow, what an interesting. That's a whole nother conversation.
It is
jumping
indeed.
Jumping back to sort of your background. Just where are you from? To me, it's always interesting to ask archaeologists where they came from and how they initially got interested in archaeology.
How they got there. Well, I was born in Milwaukee to a middle-class family. We moved to Michigan when I was 4 or 5. Grew up in Michigan. Spent all my summers up in northern Michigan in a canoe, fishing, etc. 5 siblings, none of whom are interested in what I do, basically. I mean, they tolerate me, but they're all sort of standard folks. And I was always outside, always grubbing around in the dirt, doing stuff. And one of the things that my dad did when we were growing up is he got us involved in an organization called Indian Guides. Indian Guides was a YMCA kind of Boy Scout kind of thing through the YMCA, but it was focused on Indian lore, Indian background, and that sort of thing. And I got totally fascinated with what we call relics, Indian relics, arrowheads, that sort of stuff. I even tried making them when I was a kid, had no clue what I was doing. I would get little pieces of stone and grind them around and try to make the shape of an arrowhead. But I didn't have a lot of exposure to real archaeology. I mean, this was quite a while back back in the 50s and 60s. And so I didn't go very far other than just having this real interest. And Native American stuff, I would get books about Native American cultures or various and sundry things and read what I could. But I was also very keen, like many kids are, on snakes and lizards and stuff. So I wanted to be a herpetologist. That was my goal when I went to university. And then we moved from Michigan down to Tucson, Arizona in the mid 60s. And we lived out on the desert outside of the city. And the first thing I was out, we were looking for rattlesnakes. Oh man, the reptiles on the desert were so much better than what we had in Michigan. And they were so much more available. And so in my wanderings around, I kept finding artifacts. Every now and again, I find a potsherd or something like this. And I thought, well, this is really cool. And so time came for me to go to university and I had to decide what to do. So I looked into the herpetology route and realized very quickly that there was a lot of hard science involved, a lot of biology, a lot of hard science courses that I was going to have to take. And I just thought, I just want to play with snakes. I don't want to do all this stuff. So I decided to do anthropology because that was where you could do archaeology. And so then I got to the University of Arizona into the anthropology department and started taking archaeology courses. One thing led to the next. I started making arrowheads, et cetera, et cetera. And then I had some amazing opportunities through that program of meeting people from different places in the world. Francois Borde, Jacques Tixier, who are paleoarchaeologists in France, came and gave lectures, did workshops, and got me really inspired to look at archaeology in a bigger sense. And I also had mentors for Southwestern American archaeology. And one thing led to the next, and I just took off. And over the years, as I was, had to do half trial, will travel, to make a living, working on digs and stuff, I got the realization that maybe strictly academic career wasn't really my path. So I didn't go to graduate school right away. I took several years off, got an opportunity to go to Cambridge University to do experimental archaeology, which was brand new at that time. And I was getting kind of bored with half trial, will travel. And so I said, what the heck, why not? So I got admitted there, and then I sort of got a little more involved with sort of the academics of archaeology. Of course, Cambridge, it was very academic. But I still maintain that real excitement about sort of doing the archaeology rather than just talking about it or reading about it. And so when I came back, when I finished my PhD, came back, I applied for a couple jobs, one at the Smithsonian, one at Berkeley, got interviewed and realized that this probably wasn't really my route. Really wasn't really keen on the whole sort of academic concept. In the meantime, I was publishing academic papers on my own work. So I kept doing other things. And then in the early 1980s, actually 1980, when contract archaeology started to come in a big way, I set up a company with a colleague, actually two colleagues, my wife and I, and he and his wife, and started doing contract archaeology, CRM as we call it these days. And that worked very well. We were doing very, very well on that business. But I also found that extremely boring because it was all trying to sort of conform to what some bureaucrat wanted us to do. You do your work, but you don't get to dig. You do this and you have to write it a certain way. And each agency we worked for wanted something different. And basically we were exposed to a lot of archaeology that we couldn't do. Okay. That wasn't me. So in 1982, I applied for a position in a new not-for-profit called Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, and was hired as one of the two archaeologists. And for the next 14 years, I was able to do research archaeology with public participation, which was a really important aspect. There, I really started to shine, if you want to use that term. In the meantime, I was still doing my outside archaeology when I could with colleagues from all over the world. So I, again, wasn't into an academic setting, but I was exposed to a lot of academics as well as the general public and what the general public cared about. What were they interested in? And during that tenure, I did a lot of research archaeology, again, with public participation. I also set up the first Native American advisory group, which was before we sort of had to do that through government mandate, and got Native American people involved in what we were doing, mostly Pueblo people, because we were doing Pueblo archaeology. And then that went on for a while, and then I kept doing other projects when I could, such as the Central Asia thing that you talked about. My connection with Russia came during that time period. And then after that, I sort of, they downsized, and I was the one that got down, one of the several people who got downsized. And so then I went into private consulting for 7 years, and then I got an offer to run a program in the University of Exeter for 1 year as a maternity leave replacement. And that was running an experimental archaeology program, which is, again, one of my favorite things. That ended up being 14 years. And so I eventually kept doing that and doing lots and lots of other research, and involvement all over Europe and South Asia, etc. And also started to get involved with people in South America and some of the research down there. And so that sort of led up to my retirement in 2017. Came back to Colorado, still emeritus professor at the university. And I've been busier ever since. Wow. So that's a real quick bio.
Yeah, no, that's exceptional, and and your sort of independent, scholastic approach is, I'm glad you shared that. I was not aware of your background in contract archaeology and sort of the non-academic approach, although obviously you've worked at and you're still associated with a major university. But I think you demonstrate, and there's others in the field as well who can show that they are truly scholars, and yet they're sort of unaffiliated, if you will. So I always have great respect for that approach. Let me ask you about your time in Russia. That is a bit different. It seems a little bit of an outlier, your interest in what was going on in Central Asia with horse domestication. Make sense of that for me.
Okay, I can do that fairly quickly, I guess. One of the parts of my career that was really, really important was my work with George Frizen in Wyoming and Dennis Stanford in eastern Colorado on Paleo-Indian sites and research. And they both were very, very keen on the whole sort of experimental, what can that bring to the research. And so I got involved with a lot of their projects. And then George Frizen was asked to be part of an exchange program with Olga Soffer, who was an archaeologist that actually came from Russia originally, to go to the Soviet Union in 1989 with a delegation, which is the first one that was invited. 10 Americans. It turned out to be 9 Americans and 1 Brit. And we went and visited the archaeological sites in Russia that were being excavated, met colleagues there. And part of our group was George Frizen, Lou Binford. There's some really high-end folks that were invited on this particular exchange. And then they came back over the United States, and we took them around to places here and and then we had a joint publication that came out of that. And during that, I met some very interesting Russian colleagues, Soviet colleagues at the beginning, but then turned to Russian colleagues not soon thereafter. And I was invited to come over and work on some of their projects, and I did that. found ways to do that, and did several major publications with them. I've continued that correspondence, although that's gotten a little more difficult in recent years. And I moved on to other things, but I got involved in Paleolithic archaeology, primarily what we call Upper Paleolithic, so from about 40,000 years on, and worked with them, a group of them quite extensively, all the way across different parts of Western Russia, European Russia. And I had one session up on New Siberian Islands, way above the Arctic Circle, which was really interesting stuff because everything was preserved. I mean, it was permafrost. We had all the baskets, everything from 8,500 years ago. That was fascinating. And the Central Asia was kind of a different angle, but it did ultimately go back to some of the things that were going on that trip to the Soviet Union. And one of the things was that there's a site in east of Moscow, it's 15, 20,000 years old, that had some burials that had some long ivory spears in them. It's called sungir. And these long ivory, single pieces of ivory, straight lances. And there was a big controversy about how did they take a mammoth tusk, which is curved, and make a straight spear out of it. So we got into some rather interesting debates about how this could be done. And Lou Binford said, well, I've got some African elephant tusks back at the University of New Mexico. Bradley and I'll do some experiments. Okay, so I said, sure, I can do that. You're only 3-4 hours away. I can come down. Nothing ever came of it. However, word got out that we'd done these experiments that we hadn't done. And so I got invited to a conference on bone, antler, and ivory artifacts in Italy. My way paid, all expenses paid. So I said, I can't pass that up. What can I do? Because I hadn't done anything. I never touched a piece of ivory. So I came up with a presentation that sort of synthesized all the bone artifacts and ivory artifacts from Clovis and early Paleo-Indian over here, went over there. There's a long story, but anyhow, I can get to it. Went over there. There was a person there called Sandy Olson, who was very, very much a zooarchaeologist and into this sort of stuff. She saw my presentation. She invited me to become co-PI on an application to the National Science Foundation to do work in Kazakhstan and Central Asia on horse domestication. My thing was I was going to do the analysis of the flakestone tools and the bone artifacts. Okay. So we got the grant, and I ended up spending 5 sessions, excavating what they call Neolithic sites in Kazakhstan. And then that's where I met a colleague who was another zooarchaeologist, Alan Outram, who was at the University of Exeter. You can see how these things all sort of integrate. It's a web of interactions, connections, and it's all about having opportunities and being able to take advantage of them. So my interest wasn't the horse domestication, but I was able to, from my expertise, to contribute to that. So This is what I'm saying. Almost all archaeology is highly collaborative. It involves many, many, many different people and different backgrounds, different interests, physicists, geneticists, go on and on. And so I've been very fortunate over the years to have opportunities to experience those collaborations.
Yeah. I think of it as inherently multidisciplinary. It really has to be. Well, that's fascinating. It's well, of course, you also, I believe, spent some time in Siberia and in Russia looking for Clovis antecedents. Was that not one of the first locations you looked at for the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Yes and no. I was able to get to St. Petersburg and Moscow, to the main repositories, museums with these materials all the way from across Siberia. I didn't actually do field work in Siberia, but was able to look at the collections. And there are some really interesting things that are still not quite as investigated as they should be, but they're over in Western Russia, not in Eastern Russia. And through all of that, and Dennis Stanford, my colleague that I worked with very closely at the Smithsonian, he spent years and years and years doing field work in Alaska looking for the antecedents of Clovis, because we all knew that's where it came from.
Of
And
course. Have to.
it had to. There was no alternative. And in his 30 years of sessions, he didn't live up there for 30 years, but he went up there specifically looking for things that could be ancestral to Clovis, never found anything. And so I came at it from a different direction, from the Russian side, looked at all the collections that were out there, ones that were sort of proposed as maybe being antecedent, and it just didn't work. It just didn't work. And that's how we ended up getting together. So that Russian connection was kind of really important. Now, I worked with Dennis on the High Plains and Paleo-Indian before, so we already had that connection. But to come together from my experiences in southwestern Europe and Iberian Peninsula, in the Upper Paleolithic archaeology, in France and in Spain, and really what we call Basque country, and then with my Clovis background, which I did a lot of work in Clovis with Dennis Stanford. You mentioned Vance Haynes earlier. I worked on sites with Vance Haynes. He was a bit of a mentor. And then Michael Collins in Texas, and we'll get to that story later on probably. I had a huge amount of background in Clovis and early Paleo-Indian in North America. And that led me to giving a paper at a conference in La Plata, Argentina in 2010, when I met colleagues down there that got all excited about sort of not just mine, but our approach to looking at the earliest materials in North America, and was invited to participate in a number of projects down there. And since then, I've been working with people, close colleagues in Brazil and Uruguay primarily, but also Argentina and Chile. And so, again, it's part of this web that all integrates and happens. At the same time as all that's going on, I'm still doing Pueblo archaeology. So
I've been to Crow Canyon, by the way. It's a great facility.
It's had its real interesting history and made some pretty significant contributions, especially to connecting with the general public. And, and some good research. So that was a good 14 years.
Yeah, no, exciting. All right, well, let's jump into the theory for which you were probably best known, which is the Solutrean hypothesis. Where in this incredible tapestry of a career that you've sort of outlined here, at what point do you start to formulate the ideas that ultimately led to the Solutrean hypothesis?
Okay, it started actually really early. I first was introduced to the Solutrean as a archaeological culture by a professor at the University of Arizona, Art Jelinek, who I took a class from. And Art was doing, at that time, he was doing archaeological research in southwestern France with Francois Borde. And he just said in a class one day that it was really interesting. There's this Solutrean stuff over there in the Iberian Peninsula, Basque country, that looks kind of like Clovis, And I thought, really? And I was just starting to find out about Clovis, really. He said, yeah, but it can't be related. But it's just curious. Maybe it's a good example of convergent evolution. And so he wrote a paper and published it in 1972, comparing at a very general sense, very general level, Solutrean, which of course by itself is highly variable, but generally speaking, Solutrean and Clovis, and published this paper. His conclusion was it was convergent evolution. Well, okay, fair enough. He's a really good professor. I really respect him. That's what he says. Well, when I got over there and started poking around in France, and got my hands on a lot of Solutrean material at the museum in Les Aisies, I was given access to everything that was in the collection there. it got me more and more fascinated about the convergences. How does this converge to that? And this one and that one, and et cetera, et cetera. And over the next number of years, occasionally I'd bring up the subject someplace saying, I'm not so sure that was convergence. It's just so much that's the same. And I would actually talk about it to colleagues, and they'd say, well, yeah, but there can't be any connection. Yeah, you're probably right. And then one year, Dennis Stanford, who, like I said, I've been working with him in the plains in up until the early 80s. In the late 1980s, we were on the same sort of conference out here, Pecos Conference in Southwest Colorado. And we got sitting around a campfire and we started talking about this. And Dennis said, there just isn't anything in Siberia, Eastern Siberia, and you've been over there, or North China or Beringia that could be antecedent. It's not old enough and it doesn't look like it. And I said, well, that's interesting because I know where there is a place where it's old enough and it looks just like it. Not exactly. And so we started talking about it. He was pretty resistant to the concept. And at that point, I was being more devil's advocate than anything. And then over the next several years, we got working at it more. And he said, we need to investigate this. We need to figure this out. It's just not good enough to say, oh, it's convergent. And so I can't remember exactly how it worked out, but either he got the grant or I can't remember how we got the money, but we got the money to go over to Basque Country and actually delve more into the Solutrean collections. And we got access to the museums in northern Spain, France, Paris, Bordeaux, all these places, Les Aziz especially, and really started to come to the conclusion that we needed to look at this in great detail and not just say, well, this kind of looks like that. And that's when we sort of formulated our research, knowing full well that we were probably up against a brick wall no matter what we did. And we weren't convinced at that point. And so let's look at, and we decided to look at in great detail. So he did the background stuff for what the archaeology was in Beringia. I did it for what was in Europe, and brought our things together. And then we started to say, well, boy, there's an awful lot of data here, and we've got to figure out how to present this. And the idea came to us, oh, what we need to do is develop a hypothesis. We got evidence, but it's not enough evidence to really make a statement that we think this is what happened. So we developed this hypothesis, and that brought us into the environmental reconstruction of the North Atlantic in the age time period and when things were going on in what's called the last glacial maximum, 25 to 18, 17,000 years ago, what was happening there. And we came up with this concept of, okay, what about the idea that maybe people migrated, or maybe didn't migrate, they expanded from what's called the Basque refugium during the last glacial maximum, and actually followed the ice, followed the animals across the front of the ice, which was going back and forth annually, which made a bridge. Now, Beringia, that we all believed was the land bridge, also had an ice bridge at the same time. It was covered in ice. And so we thought, well, if they can make it from Beringia across 20,000 years ago, why couldn't they make it from Europe across? And that's how we started to formulate this concept. We sort of, each of us in our own way, sort of got colleagues and sort of started talking about them to them. We were always told by all of them we're nuts, that there's no way it could be that. And so we didn't get a lot of backing, but we decided, what the heck, it's a hypothesis. We can come up with things to test. What do we do? What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is an idea that has some evidence to support it, but needs a lot of testing. So we came up with this hypothesis. It was I'd almost call it a conspiracy in a way, because there were just a few colleagues we could talk to about it that didn't just shut us out. And we came up with this hypothesis. We developed it. We were going to publish, and so we wrote articles that were completely rejected immediately without being read for publication and peer review. They didn't even make it to peer review. And I said, well, okay. So we started talking about this in more of the public venue. Go to archaeological society meetings and give a presentation, that sort of thing. And eventually I did in the early 20s, 2021, I think it was, I set up a lecture tour in Great Britain because I had a lot of colleagues over there. And I went to like 8 universities in Great Britain, Cambridge, Edinburgh, you name it, just about all the big universities. And I gave our presentation. And they were fascinated by it. Oh, I skipped a step. In 1999, there was a conference pulled together that was called Clovis and Beyond. And we gave Dennis gave our presentation, our idea at that conference. And we were almost thrown out of the room. The reaction was so negative. One of our colleagues was overheard in the audience, saying to another colleague, I really hate to see Dennis throw his career away like this during the presentation. And so anyhow, both of us said, okay, never mind. We're not going to back off. We think we've got something worthwhile. So I gave a presentation in Durham, and happened to be the editor of World Archaeology magazine was there. And a week later, he called me up and said, maybe it was a couple weeks later, anyhow, called me up and said, Bruce, I want you and Dennis to write an article for World Archaeology. I said, well, geez, we've tried articles and haven't gone anywhere. And the part of the problem is that articles have a very short length. You can't put all your data in them and all your stuff. There just isn't room. He said, well, don't worry about that. I think you really need to get this published in a peer-reviewed journal. So I said, okay. I talked to Dennis. I said, okay, I'll do this and we can do this together, but I'll do most of the writing and stuff. And then, so I agreed. And then I got a call from the editor, Peter Rowley Conway, saying, well, there's a problem. Turns out World Archaeology has themed issues, and each issue has its own editor. Okay, so the overall editor wanted this in, and there was a new issue coming up on North American archaeology. But the issue editor wouldn't even accept it to be read. Right? He wouldn't even accept it to be read. Even though
on what grounds can somebody
he says
take
it's
that
impossible,
stand?
you're nuts. I mean, there was all kinds of things said. And so
I mean, ad hominem attacks, and then that to me, impossible. Based on what criteria? I guess the idea is that there is no way they could have made the journey, right?
That's right. Basically, is what it boils down to.
Right? That is a bold presumption.
Yes, it's a presumption, and so the chief editor said, well, it can't get into that issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put out a new annual issue called Debates in Archaeology, and yours is going to be the first article in it. And so we got our article in it, peer-reviewed, which was also a struggle. They sent it out to 7 different peer reviewers instead of the usual 2 or 3. And so it was decided. So in 2004, we actually published our first peer-reviewed article on that.
2004.
And then,
wow.
Of course, immediately there was a response to that. And I don't want to get into too much of the sort of conflicts that happened. There was a response to it published in 2005, and then we responded to that in 2006, all in World Archaeology. That's all available online. You can see the sequence of events there. We found that the challenges to our hypothesis were virtually useless. I mean, first of all, they weren't constructive, and secondly, they spun what we said. They said things they implied things that we didn't say. So we just kept going at it and decided, never mind, we're going to continue doing what we're doing. And in the meantime, Dennis was at the Smithsonian. He was the department chair of the anthropology department of the National Museum of Natural History. He had a lot of other things going on. He had a lot of resistance from his own staff. In fact, he didn't get promotions because of it. I started my career at University of Exeter in 2003 and got lots of support, not because they liked the hypothesis, but because it was very controversial. It got a lot of headlines, and they wanted a publication. They wanted a big publication with my name on it. And of course, I wanted that too, because that's the way academics work. That's how I get promoted. So Dennis and I were trying to figure out what to do, and we got an unsolicited contact from an editor at University of California Press that said they wanted to sign a contract with us for a book. Okay. And that they'd give us some upfront money to help us with it. And we used some of that to go back to Spain and France, Basque Country. And so we accepted the contract and started working on a book, which eventually came out, and we can look at that in a minute. And it took us, from the time that we started that to the time that it actually was published, was probably about 9 years. And our real challenge was there was so much new data coming in constantly in genetics and North Atlantic ecology, et cetera, et cetera. New older than Clovis sites being found all over the place in the Americas. And we have to keep integrating all that stuff. And meanwhile, I was busy doing my life, and we weren't getting paid to do this as part of our jobs. So we were busy with our own lives, and Dennis was very busy at the Smithsonian. So it stretched out a lot longer than we had originally intended. The editor at the California Press then moved on to another job. We got a new editor that was hostile to our idea. But we had a contract, and eventually we got the book published. And that basically lays out all of our arguments with very, very little variation since 2012. There's been new data that's come in, of course, in a lot of different fields. And I would say all of that data has not harmed our hypothesis at all. There's the genetics, which we'll talk about a little later, maybe, which is not my area, so I don't want to delve into that too deeply. But there's geneticists that have information that say, yes, there was genetics in North American populations before contact with Europe that came from Western Eurasia, and others are saying, no, that's not right, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's their argument. So I don't want to get into that too much. So anyhow, so we published that, and we got these responses I talked about. And then we kept working on other things and getting involved in older than Clovis sites and publishing other information that led into this as well, fed into this. And that's basically where it comes from.
Great backstory. Thank you. Let's chat about the gatekeeping. I think it's probably a good segue to discuss a little bit about that. And I'm going to share with you just a simple analogy, and I know you have many, of course, of your own. You probably heard a million of them. But for me, looking at it, the connection is, borderline self-evident, particularly with Parsons Island. But it's like you have a two-door Bronco on this side of the ocean and a four-door Bronco on that side of the ocean. They're not exactly the same, but you know that there's enough similarities that there has to be a connection. I think the connection, one can make a legitimate argument, is unclear. We don't know exactly what happened. We don't know when. We don't know the various mechanisms involved. But to me, the only reason that connection is not openly acknowledged as again borderline self-evident is because diffusion has taken on an overly political value within our zeitgeist, within our social milieu and consequently scientific milieu. That we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater as it relates to diffusion theory. What do you think?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can't disagree with that. Yeah, there's a lot of analogies that I think we can make in the scientific process. So maybe that'll come up. I don't know. Let's see. But yes, we had extremely strong negative reactions in North America to our hypothesis, with a few notable exceptions. And especially the people that had both, there's very few of us, had worked both in the Upper Paleolithic of Southwestern Europe or Eurasia in general, and early Paleo-Indian North in the Americas, and pre-Clovis, as we call it, older than Clovis sites. Those people have all been very supportive of the concept of we've got to figure out where this stuff came from and how did it get here and how did it develop, and let's see the data, let's see the evidence. So we've had, it hasn't been universal in terms of rejection. In the meantime, after our book came out, I was invited to come and give talks in many, many different parts of the world. Partly because I was doing projects there, and they thought, since I was there, why didn't I give a talk? And so I did. So I gave our presentation, as you mentioned earlier, in South America in 2010. Cautious but very positive reception. The main problem they had was imagining people getting across the North Atlantic during the Ice Age. All the rest of it looked really good, but they couldn't conceive of how people could do that. And I think that's the main issue that we have in North America too. I gave presentations all over Western Europe, Central Europe, and over the years in China, India, Africa, all over the Americas. And the only place that I've hit real, what I consider non-considered responses is in North America and a little bit in Spain. France, they couldn't care less much about this because they're not interested in who got here when, generally speaking. The Spanish colleagues, not all of them, some of them have been very open, but the ones that haven't been have been very, very worried about how our theory might affect Native American issues. And, we don't think that's an issue that we need to deal with, but we'll talk about that later too, maybe. And I was told that by one of our Spanish colleagues before we wrote our book and presented and published that it was irresponsible to do this. Their hypothesis was irresponsible because it was somehow denigrating Native American issues or rights. And I said, there's nothing to do with Native American issues and rights, really. And so we had that. I think that's coming out as basically colonial guilt. How could people from Spain to 20,000 years ago be the first, which we don't think that's even right, folks to therefore and somehow claiming and, that they're there before everybody else. And I think the Spanish colleagues intellectually don't like that concept and sort of a white supremacy issue. Everywhere else, we, both Dennis and I, gave this presentation. We've had guarded but positive responses. So this idea that everybody in the world thinks it's crazy is just completely wrong. I'd like to see some statistics on that. They keep saying this and keep publishing in letters to the editor and stuff about how crazy we are and nobody accepts it. But from my experience, it's actually, as a hypothesis, not as the answer, it's been very highly received, very well received.
Yeah.
And one of the big issues has always been, they didn't have boats. They couldn't have done it. They couldn't have got here by boats. Show us the boats. But when I give this presentation, especially in places like Scandinavia, a maritime-based people, and they never ask about boats. That's a given. People at that time, of course, they had boats.
Yeah.
Water is a highway. It's not an impediment. And so it's been really interesting, the different reactions I get. South Americans and people that are sort of landlocked can't quite understand, especially in tropical areas, can't quite understand how people could get across the North Atlantic in the Ice Age. But that's a problem with background and imagination, I think.
Yeah.
So
Well,
anyhow, that's
sorry.
No, that's fine.
I mean, I can tell you anecdotally that from my experience, having beers with people at professional conferences, and the people I know in my network. You've been doing this professionally for 25 years or more. There are a lot of people who support the theory in North America in the archaeological community, but they are scared to talk about it. There still is this whatever is pushing back, like you said, the colonial guilt, perhaps. It's probably the best explanation for it. But they feel like it's just too controversial to address, and they prefer not to talk about it. And to me, I just don't. I'm more along your lines, where I don't see the connection. It's an ancient process that we're talking about. Has nothing to do with colonialism, modern politics, or anything else. There's data sets here. There's data sets here, and it looks like there's a clear connection. And you talk about some. I saw one of the critiques recently, sort of pointing to the de minimis number of attributes between the two assemblages, and I just think that that's a flat out incorrect. There seems like there are people who are commenting on the theory who really haven't even read the book, or don't even understand what it is that you're saying, and they're missing the point entirely. And that's really ignorant in a way.
It is frustrating to do all that work and then have people just say, well, yeah, but it was just convergent evolution, without taking the time to do the work and show the archaeological record of convergence. If it's converging, it means it's going through a process that comes together. Okay, show us the process. Where's the archaeological evidence of the process? And the most frustrating part has been, in their own work, they use exactly the same criteria of evaluation that we're using to their own archaeological evidence to come to their conclusions. And I'll give you an example of that. There's an archaeological culture in Eastern Asia called the Duktai. It starts back in the early time periods of the Upper Paleolithic. And you can see through archaeological evidence, tool types, sort of way of making your living, the kind of hunting and the kinds of sites that you see and the kind of assemblages that you get. You can see that slowly develop into what's called Denali in Eastern Beringia. There's a really good case for this. You can actually track the changes through time and what changes and what doesn't. And people are putting that out as Denali comes from Duktai. Great. Fantastic. When we use exactly the same process, saying Clovis comes from Solutrean, they say nonsense. It's convergence. So the most frustrating part is colleagues that aren't willing to step back and say, okay, let's use the same criteria. Instead, what we're seeing is, we presume that it couldn't have happened, therefore it didn't happen. And therefore, just because I use this process over here doesn't mean that this process used the same way over here comes to the same conclusion. And that's really frustrating, because it's so biased. We just use the same criteria, use it the same way. And I've got an image here I want to show you that demonstrates that. The bottom one down there, the cluster analysis. Okay, so in our book, we organized our data, and we're looking primarily at archaeological remains, so stone tools, bone tools, and each what we call archaeological culture that's been identified and described and defined, that we thought was relevant, we put on a list, and then we took all the characteristics of those things in relation to the tools and made a chart. So we have the cultures on one side, the tools across the top, and are they present or absent in these different assemblages? Okay, so we've been accused of just using very superficial comparisons. Oh, this looks like that. And we said, here we've got 47 criteria that we're using. We're applying equally to everything across the board, technological, typological, etc. And we came up with this diagram, an Excel chart. And then we subjected it to cluster analysis. Now, this is a process that statistically looks at all these different criteria and says what could or couldn't, what's most likely related. And that chart that you see on the left here under cluster analysis is what we came up with. So you can see on the upper right, Aurignacian, Gravettian, Magdalenian, early Solutrean. Those are all the southwestern cultures that don't have Solutrean characteristics, except for early Solutrean. And then you've got, these clusters were defined by this program. We didn't put them together this way. You can see the tree starting from the left. And the ones that clustered together were Aurignacian, Gravettian, Magdalenian, and those are the Western European ones. The next group of clusters, except for early Solutrean, the next ones are Ushki, Nenana, Denali, Mesa, Sluisway, and Duktai, I just talked about. They clustered together. And you can see another branch way up the very, very left at the top, the separation in the Euro-American is Middle Solutrean, Late Solutrean, Spanish Solutrean, Pre-Clovis, and Clovis. Now, this kind of analysis is done all the time in archaeology, right? Taking these criteria and putting them through statistical analysis. We can explain the early Solutrean. It should never have been called that. It's not. But that's neither here nor there. Forget about that little issue. And so we published this, and we very quickly got a thing saying, well, you used the wrong approach. You should have used cladistics, because this is what archaeologists that really know what they're doing use. So he said, okay, there are some issues with cladistics. I got in contact with a guy specializing in it, and he was happy to help me. And one of the issues with cladistics, it assumes connection. So they use this in genetics all the time, cladistic analysis. I'm not a statistician. It's all way over my head. But one of the problems is it's already assuming that there's a connection, whereas the cluster analysis doesn't. Okay. So never mind. So he said, okay, you want cladistic analysis? We'll run the same data through cladistics. And that's where we got this dendrogram on the right. And notice what clusters: French Gravettian, Magdalenian, early Solutrean, and then another cluster, pre-Clovis, North Spanish Solutrean, Clovis fluted, Middle French Solutrean, Late French Solutrean. And then all the Beringian things clustered together. In other words, we got exactly the same result. And we have not heard a single word since we got this. They didn't say, oh, yeah, okay, you were right after all. We got nothing. And so, this is the state we're in right now. Anything we put out that seems to support it is basically just not recognized as being there.
All right, so just so I understand exactly what we're looking at here in this table, these are looking at attributes of individual tools or assemblages or both between these.
All of that.
Okay.
We used entire assemblages, although we were accused of cherry picking our data. But in our book, we put it all out. We put it all in there. And we published the data table at the back of the book. So if people want to go back in and say, well, I don't agree that this was present or absent, they can do that, but they haven't.
So this is essentially as good as it's going to get as it relates to the equivalent, the proverbial genetic relationship between these tool types. I'm not to confuse with genetics, by the way. I'm not talking about DNA. I'm just saying, like,
no. But it's the same kind of analysis.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the same kind of analysis. You're trying to find out how closely things are related based on these criteria.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean historically related.
Yeah.
The historical relations are an interpretation of this data.
Okay? So
Go ahead.
Just where we have the Aurignacian, Gravettian, and Magdalenian, it looks like they're on your cluster analysis. There's a closer relationship to the Eastern Asian site tool types than to the Euro-American side, but then on the cladistic tree, that's inverted. Am I seeing that correctly or no?
Probably. I have a real hard time of really understanding the details of how this all works. Um, every statistical method is based on assumptions of some sort. And like I said, the assumption of connection in cladistics is something I don't quite understand,
Okay.
whereas cluster doesn't. Now, yeah, I mean that's a good observation. Nobody's come back with that observation to me, and I would take this to a statistician and see what this means, but I haven't done that because
Yeah.
nobody's pointed that out before.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I'm reading it correctly, I'm not a statistician either, but there is something that maybe we'll chat about a little bit later, which might possibly be uh, connected in some way or have some relevance to that particular chart.
Sure.
But
The
yeah,
one thing I
so
will say about this is that the one thing that's better in a sense with the cladistics is you can see those little numbers where things fork off.
yeah, yeah,
That tells you the criteria that makes that distinction.
yeah,
Okay, so when you get up to 23 there, that's probably bifacial technology. Okay, so in pre-Clovis and all these things, you have bifacial technology, but you don't in the stuff in blue. So that's one thing that helps. Whereas you don't get that in the cluster analysis. You can't see where that break took place. What was the criteria that made that
I
break?
see. Yeah, that makes sense. Now it's fascinating stuff. Look, I mean, I do want to get into the meat of the theory, and I have some questions
Sure.
um, that I want to kind of pick your brain on a little bit here. But before we jump into that, I do have a question. Do you feel like there is a momentum that is building for at least a larger sort of percentage of the archaeological community accepting, or at least accepting that this is possible, as opposed to what you maybe had experienced previously, where the doors kind of were slammed in your face?
Yes, I have, and partly because Dennis is gone now, but uh, made a big effort to get out there and actually present the evidence to people directly. Um, and when they actually see it up on the screen, and I take casts of things with me that they can handle, and I can point these things out. It's made a big difference. Um, so it becomes more tactile than strictly intellectual. But yes, I think there's definitely moving that direction. But there's, Mike, you got to remember, there's still fairly highly respected colleagues that don't buy anything older than Clovis, no matter what. Even though we've
Yeah,
got 75 sites now that are dated in the Americas that look like, oh yeah, they're all controversial, because you can always find something bad about a site that doesn't fit your agenda. But the dating's wrong. They're not really tools, and on and on. But the reality is, older than Clovis is now pretty universally accepted, and which is a basic fundamental necessity for our hypothesis, right?
yeah,
For
yeah.
Solutrean to be the
Well,
origin of Clovis, there's got to be something before Clovis,
sure.
which there isn't
Absolutely.
in
Well,
Siberia or
that's
Beringia.
a really interesting point, and I do want to talk to you about the chronological gaps a bit. And incidentally, one of the interviews that we did here was with Michael Fott, and he talked about dual origins for Paleo-Americans, and is quite good with the genetics, at least from my understanding of it. And it looks like there is mounting evidence, with exception, and this is a big one, of a dearth of genetic data from Solutrean sites, which I think,
There's none.
eventually, when we we get those data, it will be illuminating. Um, let's talk,
I
if
agree.
you would, about Parsons Island, because I know you worked out there. And to me,
Okay.
it's kind of the smoking gun. And I know you have a slide on that too, I believe.
Yep. Why don't you pull that one up? The first one there. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
So tell
good.
me, just let me
We can
set the
talk about
scene a little
Parsons
bit.
Island.
Yeah, I'll just set
Sure.
the scene for the audience that may not be aware. You and Dennis Stanford write this terrific book. It's about the Solutrean hypothesis. One of the criticisms at the time had been that we're not really seeing anything that looks exactly like Solutrean in North America, with the exception of the Sinmar Point, which had sort of dubious provenience, but certainly looks Solutrean-like. But people can throw stones at it as they have. No pun intended. But
Yeah.
then we have Parsons Island, which has been really brought to the front in recent years, very recent years. And that this is, in my mind, a bit of a game changer. And with that, I'll throw it back to you.
Very good. I think to start this off, we have to go back. This is not really my data or Dennis's data. This is Darren Lowry. Darren Lowry grew up on Delmarva Peninsula, Chesapeake Bay, as a fisherman. His whole family were watermen, going way back in time. And one of the things as a kid, he started finding artifacts on the beaches around there and got really interested in that. And we don't want to go into his background too much. It takes too much time. But if anybody has done the work, it's Darren. And he went and got his PhD in geoarchaeology. He's a geomorphologist, in other words, a geologist first, and archaeologist second. If you can rank them, you can't really rank them because it's both. And he started to recognize things along these beaches and in the stratigraphy that you can see on the left side of this image. Very, very distinctive layers through time. And he could trace these layers all the way across islands in the Chesapeake Bay. And of course, when we're looking back at the time period that's of interest to us, 22,000 years ago or so, this was not the Chesapeake Bay. This was the uplands of the Susquehanna River, right? So this was way, way inland in terms of the ocean. It happens to be that the bay has now had very fast erosion for a long time, and he and a number of other people have been collecting stuff on the banks of these things, dredging things up out of the bottom of Chesapeake Bay and off the continental shelf for decades. Artifacts, mastodons, remains, et cetera, et cetera. So he not only got interested in it, he actually focused his whole sort of academic career on getting the background and the expertise and trying to figure it out. What's going on here? And it all goes back, first of all, to the stratigraphy. We have to know the geological context of this stuff to understand what it is. How did it get there? When did it get there? Etc. And so Parsons Island is sort of the latest, if that's the right term, the latest of a number of sites that Darren investigated. There's other ones. Miles Point was a very important site, which was allowed to be destroyed by the establishment before it could be really investigated. Oyster Cove, there's like 8 or 10 of these exposures that have produced archaeological material like what we see at Parsons Island, but small amounts of it. Parsons Island, on the other hand, Darren collected artifacts over the years from the beach. The waves would come in, undermine this stratigraphy. It's loess, so it's very, very fine grained, very easily eroded. And he would not only pick them up, but he'd document them. He'd do point locations, et cetera, kept track of all the artifacts. Eventually, he got really interested in it because he found, as you can see in the lower right, he started to find artifacts not on the beach, but actually in the profile. So in their primary context. Now, you can always argue things out of primary context could have got there in any number of ways from any number of times. This stuff was in place. This is just one of like 8 or 10 that has been found absolutely in context, all of which came from the same level. Okay. So over the years, we ended up getting quite an assemblage of artifacts. He did this analysis that you see on the upper right of the stratigraphy, massive numbers of dates, OSL dates, which is a way of checking a date based on, it's radiology of quartz grains, etc. And it's one way, and then carbon-14, which is another way looking at the dating of carbon. And he did both of these on this. He's also looked at pollen. He's looked at everything that we as archaeologists use for understanding when something happened and what the environment was when it was there. And if you look on that diagram up there, I don't know if it's big enough for people to see the detail. You can see the black stuff down near the bottom on the left-hand side. These are the levels that are well dated, that are older than Clovis, and the upper one of those two is where all of these artifacts have been found in place.
Uh-huh.
Taking the artifacts that have been found in place, comparing them with what's on the beach, they make a good assemblage. In other words, the materials on the beach aren't different from what the ones are in the profile. The other thing there is that there's no archaeological material above that level in this area that we know of, that he knows of. So there's nothing younger that's polluting this assemblage. Uh-huh. So he and we make the case that the assemblage of artifacts that we're talking about is a coherent group of things that belong together that came out of that 22,000-year-old level. Okay, go to the next slide, please. There we go. Okay, this is basically the assemblage that has come from Parsons Island. And so this is the one, like you say, potentially the smoking gun, but at least for any other purpose, it's the most complete, showing us the widest range of variation from this time period. For instance, at Miles Point, we only have one of the small projectile point type things. So there's an overlap on the figure, never mind. And a couple other artifacts. And some of these other sites, we only have 1 or 3 or 4 or 5 artifacts that were found in place that don't represent individually. The sites don't represent a wide assemblage. This assemblage is very wide. And so what it contains is both typological types of artifacts. Upper left, big biface, big thin bifaces. And then you've got the small triangular points to the right of that. Then we have a whole sequence of what we call blades, which are very special technologies of making forms to produce tools from. We have shouldered pieces that you see in the upper right. We've got one that I can't. It's overlapped there, unfortunately. That's called a plain face point, or point de face plan in French. And so what we've got is a pretty wide assemblage. You've got two basic bifacial technologies. This is where pieces are flaked on both sides to make two faces that come together on a single edge. And that's the big bifaces over here you see on the left, and the points that you see on the right. And then we have 2 different blade technologies. One's called a conical core blade technology you see in the lower left, and the other one's a flat back core technology that you can see next to it on the right. All of these are expressed in the Parsons Island assemblage. All of these are characteristic of Solutrean assemblages. Like I say, there's a wide range of Solutrean assemblages through time. It's about 5,000 years of variation and over a territory. So it's not just one thing, okay?
So you've got not only tool types that align in the assemblage, but also the manufacturing technique.
Absolutely.
You've got flaking. Do you see overshot flaking here? And
yes. Yeah, I mean, it's basic. Overshot flaking is kind of nebulous. And other people have picked up on that as if it's the only criteria we use. We don't. It was only 1 of 47. But if let's stand back and say, okay, as a matter of fact, I did this. I sent this assemblage to a very close colleague, Paleolithic archaeologist in France, Jacques Pellegrin. He looked at this assemblage and said, he was always resistant to our theory, our hypothesis. He looked at this assemblage and says, we've got to reevaluate everything. This is Solutrean.
Yeah.
If this
Yeah.
was
So
found in France, there would be no question what this was.
yeah,
And from
that's
22,000 years ago.
fascinating, and that's why I'm again from my position, which knowing a little bit about this, but certainly nowhere am I claiming to be an expert. But to me, it seems like a smoking gun. Let me ask you a question. This is a little bit inside baseball, but it's something I've struggled with a little. So to the audience, forgive me. The small kind of triangular points that are next to the laurel leaf points.
Right.
One of them, I mean, that was a little bit of like what we see at Cactus Hill, and maybe
Yes.
it down in the Acela. Is that uh, were we Parsons Island yielded? I mean, those are extreme tool types between the long lancelets and then the smaller triangular points, but they're
Right.
found together. That's very interesting.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. The small lancelets are very, very much like the Miller Point from Pennsylvania, Cactus Hill, some of the stuff in the southeast, like you're talking about. There's been quite a few of these found, but not in good context, is part of the problem.
Ah,
Um, but we also, I think the real smoking gun is the blade technologies, because blade
interesting.
technologies cannot be confused with something younger. We don't have complex blade technologies in the Americas that are like this after Clovis. Okay. Clovis is the end of the blade technologies, large blade technologies. And then some other ones are invented later, like during the Toltec and Aztec. And now we have one from South America, from the southeastern part of Brazil, that's dating to about 11,000 years ago, which is really interesting, uh, which is identical to our flat back core technology here. Um, so yes, the bifacial stuff. People say, oh, there's only so many ways you can make a biface, et cetera, et cetera. Well, okay, but let's get down to the nitty gritty. How were they made? What was the process? Is there any connection and any sequential? And what we have bifacial stuff from Siberia. It's not this old, but it's from Siberia that to me clearly indicates the origins of some of the Northwestern bifacial technologies, Northwestern North America that we see there, like at Cooper's Ferry and those places. You can see it coming right out of Japan. It's really straight, to me, very straightforward. So we're not saying that it only came from one place, but those technologies are not the same as this. They're not
What
like this. They're
what
completely
strikes
different
me too is the single
approach.
shoulder points there on the lower right. What it's interesting there. Just a little bit of background. Of course, I read about the Sandia point, and I did want
Sure.
to ask you about that and
I
Frank
can,
Hibben.
yeah,
There was I think an article in the New Yorker many years
yes,
ago, but it was entertaining and so when I came across a quartz what looked very much like what you have there. Single shoulder projectile point, a couple of them actually, in a cave in Georgia. I dismissed it as being anything other than something that would have been archaic, and I think we ended up calling it, I don't know, Moral Mountain or something. But I wonder now if I shouldn't revisit that collection a little and see if there's something to it. That's just kind of a sidebar. But do you think it's worth revisiting Hibben's Sandia theories,
no,
or is that
no.
just too murky to even consider at this point?
I think the New Yorker article covered it pretty well, but a lot of
Okay.
people wouldn't have seen that and wouldn't have access to it necessarily. Um, my interpretation, which is just my own personal opinion, I'm not disparaging anybody or anything, is that the whole thing was a hoax. Okay. And I put my evidence out there pretty clearly in that article, and that was fact checked and all that kind of stuff. Uh, I think it was somebody, the author, Frank C. Hibben, he had just come back from looking at Solutrean materials in the Pyrenees, back to his place in New Mexico. And lo and behold, Sandia material started turning up very soon thereafter with single shoulders. Okay. And we do see this single-shouldered stuff, not only in Solutrean, but you see it in Gravettian before, but not the bifacial ones. You don't see that in the earlier stuff. But anyhow, so this single shoulder is a very specific kind of form, and it all of a sudden popped up. It's in the Sandia cave assemblage. A lot of people were skeptical about it, and I was asked to come in and evaluate it, and I had no idea about the Solutrean hypothesis at that time. I think Hibben saw stuff that he was seeing ahead. He was seeing ahead, that he saw stuff that to him resembled and made the case that there might be something to look at here. But instead of having the patience to let it come out, he had to make it happen. This is my reading on it. And clearly the assemblage of shouldered pieces that came out of Sandia Cave, they're a mixed bag. There are different raw materials, there are different technologies, there are different weathering patterns. One of them had the shoulder made with the indentation was made by flaking with a nail. You could still see the scratch marks of the steel. Another one was a agate basin point. They'd been put on a wheel, a grinding wheel, and made the shoulder. And the whole thing just didn't work.
Okay.
So that's kind of muddied the waters a little bit.
Yeah, I mean it's too bad he picked Solutrean, but I think I think to your point, he may have had some foresight, but was impatient.
Yeah, so I don't buy that. That's not him coming into the equation, Sandia.
Okay, yeah, I may dig out that old report. It was on the banks of the Peachtree Creek outside of Atlanta. And they were quartz, and it was a tough material to nap, so that we don't have clear flake. The flaking scars are kind of crude, but they looked quite a bit like that. But of course, having found it post reading the New Yorker, I kind of dismissed it. But
well, that's fair enough. I mean, the rest of the assemblage that I was talking about from Sandia, they really are points, bifacial things with a shoulder that are old. But you go to any assemblage of a lot of this stuff, even a Pueblo site or something, and you can find things that were rejected during manufacture that have a shoulder on them.
Okay.
Or things that were broken and reworked that have a shoulder on them. That doesn't make them a shouldered piece. So I think that's what happened. There were a lot of things pulled out of different collections and put together as an assemblage, and then some things modified to fit. So you could have, it's worth going back and looking at it, both the technology, but also specifically the context. Everything's about context.
Well, I remember the context very well. It was under rockfall. So there was not a sedimentary context outside of the fact that there was a giant boulder that I had to break up and move out of the way, and then there was a point sitting on the cave. It was a rock shelter.
Sure.
But interesting. Well, okay. So I think you've made a terrific case here. Let's talk a little bit about what the implications might be. And there's a lot of this discussion of chronological issues, which I think have, between Parsons Island and some of the other pre-Clovis sites that have been found, a lot of that gap has been filled in. But I do think it's worth talking a bit about that and kind of imagining why, cutting to the chase here, we have, a spattering of pre-Clovis sites, and then now you have, Parsons Island, and obviously Delmarva Peninsula, that area is a hot spot. But we have this ubiquitous Clovis technology or fluted technology that runs, from North America to the Tierra del Fuego. And yet, for one reason or another, it appears that for many thousands and thousands of years, the pre-Clovis culture is, either concentrated in the southeast or in the, along the eastern woodlands, doesn't radiate out, doesn't radiate particular. Now, there are probably some examples you're going to share with me, but again, in the same with the same sort of veracity to the southern hemisphere until basically just before the Younger Dryas, and so and I don't really understand. I've never heard an explanation for why that might be.
That's a good issue. And I can take it in several different lines of discussion on that. First of all is preservation, which we have issues everywhere in the world. The older it gets, the harder it is to find. The less is preserved in good context. The other one is people weren't looking for it. I mean, had one of our very good colleagues, who's a good archaeologist, was excavated a site, Clovis site that was in place. And she was asked by a reporter, well, did you dig down below to find anything? She said, no, why should I? There's nothing older than Clovis. Okay, so why should I waste my time and energy on it? Okay, so a lot of the people that have been very resistant to the Solutrean hypothesis are also the Clovis first people. So if you say Clovis was first, then there can't be anything older. And if there can't be anything older, it can't be Solutrean, right? Okay, so that's where some of that comes from. I think you have people have a very valid concern about why don't we have more evidence of this stuff. I think it's partly because people, first of all, haven't found it in good context and haven't recognized it, like you said, with your shoulder pieces, because it hasn't been an option. There's no option to call it something else. I think that has changed dramatically.
That we're operating under. And I experienced this in my career.
It's a paradigm.
Yeah. I mean, here in Florida, and I've shared this before.
I have too.
Yeah. We terminate our shovel tests when we hit clay. Yet Barbara Purdy was pulling what looks like Lavawa style tools out of a clay lens, in the 1970s. So there's a practical matter of not digging deep enough as well, and there may also be an issue relative to waterways where with sea level rise and other issues that the probability areas that we look at now were not necessarily as high a probability zone. Those variables would change over the last 25,000 years, so that we're looking in high probability sites for our archaic and woodland materials, but perhaps not for earlier sites.
Yeah, and we dealt with that in our book to some extent. The whole issue of visibility, where would people be when they were first colonizing, if that's the right term, first occupying an area? How long would they stay there? Why would they move if they did move? Did they come in contact with other people that were already there? On and on. And it gets into a point of eventually speculation. I think the more we've been open to seeing things older than Clovis, the more we've been finding, right? Because all of a sudden it was a possibility. And maybe not all of a sudden. Maybe that's the wrong way to say it. Slowly, people became aware that there were things that were pretty hard to discount. Let's put it that way. And the more that happened, the less likely they were to be hesitant to talk about it. I mean, we got people like Steve Holland were excavating these mastodon mammoth sites on the high plains years ago, without stone tools, but with incredible bone fracturing, et cetera, dating back 17,000, 18,000 years ago, completely discounted because it couldn't be, because there weren't stone tools with it. Well, there's a possibility. In fact, we know of many cultures around the world that never used stone tools, at least in historic times. So those were discounted. They were just sort of shuffled off to the side. Lots and lots of these things were discounted. And so there was no real impetus for especially students to get involved in those issues. Right after our presentations were sort of out and about, I would get emails now and again from a student, graduate student or undergraduates, saying, "I'm really interested in your hypothesis, and I wanted to write my senior paper on this, but my professor wouldn't let me." Okay, that happened quite a few times. That hasn't happened in quite a while now, but my professor wouldn't let me. I've lost your audio. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Now I got you. I
Okay.
lost it for a bit
Sorry.
there.
I
You
said,
keep breaking up.
yeah, we're having a little connectivity issue, regrettably here. But
All
I think
right.
we're
Well,
back.
we can edit that stuff out.
Yeah, I'll clean that up a little bit. But I was saying all you have to have is a professor like Michael Fott, and then you don't have to worry about that. Um,
That's right. That's right. And I was so fortunate to have those kinds of influences in my career, like George Frizen.
yeah.
I'm not sure whether George actually was that keen on our hypothesis, but he always encouraged us to pursue it. Okay.
Good. So,
And Art Jelinek didn't like our hypothesis at all, and yet he was the one that he planted the seed. He
I
came
love it.
around.
You got
He
to be
came
open
around towards
minded.
the end saying, your evidence is pretty darn compelling. He never agreed. Same with Vance Haynes. I spent time with Vance last summer, and he agreed with all this comparison and how it was good, but he said, I just still can't buy it. He just couldn't, fair enough. I mean, we all have our sort of our line in the sand, but um, I've been very fortunate to have people like that, Mike Collins, other people that have really encouraged me to continue with this. And like
Yeah.
you said, there's an awful lot of people that when you're having beer with them, they're pretty optimistic and enthusiastic, but they'll never come out and say it. And that's because now we're getting into the other side of this, which is the gatekeeping. That's because a lot of the people that sit on the committees for both getting grants and peer reviewing are anti this hypothesis to the point where you can actually, it's less and less now, but in the early days of this, you could actually be putting your career on the line to say that this was something worth looking into.
Yeah.
I'm not
Research.
I'm not over exaggerating that either.
No, I mean, there's the saying, research goes where the money flows. And if there's no money to pursue this kind of thing, then uh, we won't be pursuing it. So backing up a little bit again to this idea of sort of Clovis being and fluted points being ubiquitous, starting,
Mm-hmm.
during, I don't know, what we might want to call the Clovis expansion. You have clearly at Parsons Island a fully formed uh, stone tool tradition that has, a clear, you know, antiquity. This doesn't just emerge out of nowhere. Um,
Right.
and you've got very diagnostic materials here, easily recognizable, and clearly there could some of the points you've mentioned, which is that maybe they're too deep, we're not looking for it. I think that there very well could be repurposing of these kinds of tools over time by certain cultures that could explain it. But in places where there isn't a lot of deposition, where you don't have to dig deep, there is not an abundance of these of these lancelet floral leaf tool types. And I don't think, forgive me, I'm just speculating now in 2025, that it's just simply a matter of in each instance of looking further and looking more. The Southwest is a good example. I mean, you've got great preservation in caves. You don't have a lot of deposition. You know, to me, and correct me if you think I'm misinterpreting this, but there's something else at play here where, for one reason or another, maybe it has to do with population explosion. Maybe it has to do with another population having come into the Americas in the late Pleistocene, and then this technology radiating out for one reason or another. But it also seems to tie into what was going on possibly with climatic fluctuation as we're moving out of uh, the Pleistocene and into the Holocene with the changes occurring then. I mean, do you agree that it's probably not just a matter of the fact that we're not digging deep enough or misinterpreting artifacts?
Yes, absolutely. When you're looking at any kind of diffusion or migration, the earliest aspects of it are always going to be very hard to come by, very hard to find. There's very few people on the landscape. We also have the issue of sea level rise, where the landscapes that the people would have been first, either east or west, were probably underwater now. Okay, we've got a huge continental shelf on the east side that we haven't really investigated. We've got a lot of tantalizing information like Sinmar that indicate there were a lot of folks out there at one time doing stuff, but we've never systematically looked at that. And that's not because we don't want to. It's very, very expensive to do. And we'll talk about that later. But the other thing is, if you look at all the older than Clovis, I don't even like to call them pre-Clovis. Mike Collins pointed this out years ago. Pre-Clovis sort of assumes that they turned into Clovis. Okay? So we're talking chronologically, they're just older than Clovis. A lot of these older than Clovis sites, especially in the West and in South America, Central America, aren't anything like Clovis. Nothing like him at all. Chicoita Cave, Santa Helena, you can name site after site after site that's older than Clovis that has no relationship whatsoever to Clovis at a later time, from my point of view, if we're using the same criteria we use for comparisons. So I think, and I've talked with Mike Collins and other people about this, we've really missed a huge amount of archaeology out there with making Clovis the baseline. Okay, everything's compared to Clovis. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar. Mike and I wrote an article called "Imagining Clovis," which proposes that Clovis expansion was a diffusion into pre-existing groups, and we make the argument of how that would work and what it was about. It was we argue very, very quickly. We argue that Clovis became a symbolic technology that was imbued with power and symbolism. That during the changeover, the loss of the megafauna, the change in environment, the sort of stresses that people all over the Americas were under at that time, were looking for something to get things back, to get things better. And so I would recommend looking at that article. It's called Imagining Clovis. It's available on my ResearchGate, etc. You can find it. It's
I think I've read it, but it's been a hot
option
minute.
that we throw out there to Clovis people marching across the landscape. Okay, there were people there before, but there are certain times in history, in cultures, where a concept sweeps across. And one of the things that we're looking at is a revitalization movement. And we discuss it in that article, but then there's other places it can be looked at where people realize things are bad. Things are going wrong. It can be the environment. It could be the neighbors. It can be internal. And they find a way to readjust their culture to work. And it's usually done through a visionary, a prophet that comes forward and people buy it. The best analogy I have historically in North America is Tecumseh. And so anyhow, we propose that as opposed to just adapting to ecological change. In other words, coming out of perceptual archaeology myself, where everything was related to the environmental change, there's also social change that has nothing to do with environment. Or it can be influenced by environment, but it's not directly a cause of environment. I mean, we're seeing cultural change now because of our perception of environment, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Okay.
No, the role of agency, the role of a charismatic individual, and and then that can work in concert with climatic issues
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
environmental stress and food stress, and so resource depletion and so forth. And so the disruption can motivate those kinds of things. So um, let's let me back up to the sort of terminal Solutrean. So how does the terminal Solutrean and the sort of introduction of, let's say Parsons Island, um, connect? And do you think that there's any kind of a connection at all with an emergence of this technology in the Western Hemisphere and a disappearance in Europe?
Actually, the answer to that is no. That might be a surprise. Uh,
Sure.
our comparisons of this, let's just use Parsons Island as the best example of this early stuff in the Americas, is actually probably more to middle Solutrean than final Solutrean. We see developments, especially in France, of things that we're not seeing in this assemblage. Um, the this assemblage is best represented by middle Solutrean. So it looks like whatever this was. Let's take our hypothesis and just evaluate it like there's some basis for it. The comparisons are taking us back to something before the final developments in Solutrean. So the Solutrean disappearing, quote unquote, in southwestern Europe does not correspond to what we think this came from. In other words, they didn't all get in boats and paddle to the North America. We see this as the influence happens from a very small segment of what was Solutrean. Okay. So we don't see all the developments, and people, especially critics, like to say, well, Solutrean was this. And we try to make it very clear Solutrean was a lot of different things. It has a fundamental underlying connection. But if you go to Ambrosia Cave in eastern Spain, it's quite different from La Riera Cave in western Spain, and then through time it changes as well, both in space and in time. And we see the highest development, quote unquote, the highest development, the most complex in southwestern France at the very end of Solutrean. We don't see those technologies in the Parsons Island material.
Okay. All right.
So
Yeah.
I don't see a connection.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. I wasn't. I'm not necessarily angling for that. I'm just curious. But let's kind of work through a little bit of a sequence here, if we can. So we've got this middle Solutrean uh, diaspora, for lack of a better term, from a very specific area that makes its way skirting the ice and sort of probably comes in somewhere in the mid Atlantic, around about Chesapeake. The dates you have at Parsons are, what are you looking at? 23,000, 22, 23. So that's interesting, because it also, by the way, those are very close to the dates that we're seeing at White Sands, which is,
Yes,
everybody, nobody seems to be questioning that, which is great. I mean, I think the dates are good. Um,
I agree.
but it seems to me, talking about the paradigm shift, I think we're seeing it with the reception of the White Sands footprints. But we can talk about that in a minute. So now you've got 23,000 years ago, thereabouts. Um, Now we have, again, a spattering, maybe that's a handful of the pre-Clovis sites that you've talked about and have dates that certainly fill that gap. But then, it isn't until about 13,000 years ago, thereabouts, when we see Clovis emerge and then radiate out.
Right.
So we're almost 10,000 years
That's right.
of time has lapsed. It's actually remarkable that there's such um, that the tradition that in terms of the tool manufacture has remained so consistent. Of obviously we have changes. You now have indented bass and flutes and so forth, but otherwise still quite a bit of similarity insofar as flaking technique. But that's a big chunk of time. What are you thinking that at that in that period of time, people are living on what is the outer continental shelf? They're in areas that are difficult and expensive to access. I've done work on the shelf in the Gulf in particular, and I understand the complexities and so forth. But they're there for damn near 10,000 years, and then there's this another population that it's either already extant or sort of is growing. We now have this climatic stressors that and maybe some agency with regards to motivation of expansion of this culture and this technology, which are kind of hand in hand, and then the expansion occurs. I'm trying to piece this together. Is that close to what you're imagining?
I think so. Yeah. There have been people that have challenged us on you can't have a tradition that lasts that long. But that's completely ignoring the South American data that we have. We've got cultures in northeastern Brazil that lasted, archaeological cultures, that lasted 8,000 years with no changes whatsoever, living toe to toe and not influencing each other. We've got what's called Ataparica, and we've got Umbu and Lagua Santa. These are all cultures that were living in the same environment with totally different technologies for 8,000 years each. Okay. The earliest now you see a little bit of change in Umbu, but not much. The earliest Lagua Santa looks like the latest Lagua Santa. It's just, you can't tell the difference. And that's 8,000 years. So our concept, I think we're really influenced strongly by the whole archaic record, the Paleo-Indian archaic record, where we see these consistent changes through every few hundred years that are really distinctive, and we can say, oh, that's that and that's that just by looking at it, and this is when it came from. That's not the case in South America. It's very different. And then, of course, when you get back into the Paleolithic, people want to ignore this. Solutrean, 5,000 years. Yes, there's changes, but basically it's more or less the same for 5,000 years. You get back to Aurignacian and you've got 11,000 years. You get back to Middle Paleolithic and we're talking 150,000 years with no change.
Yeah.
So this whole issue of change is to me, it's kind of a red herring. I mean, again, you have to make people are making assumptions that people have to change with the environment. That's the one thing about Clovis and this whole expansion that makes us think that it isn't just environmental adaptation, is Clovis and South American fishtail come on that landscape out there all the way, like you say, to Terra del Fuego within a few hundred years with no changes in technology or tool types or in every environment from subtropical to subarctic. Well, if people were always changing because of the environment, why does that happen?
Yeah.
It's because those traditions.
Is there's a big mystery left to be solved here.
Yes.
And we're seeing pieces of the puzzle, but I think it's going to be some time before it makes a whole lot of sense. And I think the missing pieces of the puzzle are either very deep, and we're not digging deep enough in some cases, particularly here in the southeast and probably mid-Atlantic. And then I think a lot of it's underwater. And then I also think we have what's going on in the southern hemisphere or south of the United States, I would say, is just sort of a dearth of data. You look at the kinds of sites that are being recorded and worked on in Mexico, for example. I mean, there's just so much material there. They're focused on the Maya and the Aztec and other culture groups that are recognizable and have taken on a level of importance to national identity or whatever
Sure.
tourism. So you see the data kind of starts to dip, let alone trying to work in the Amazon, which
Yeah, exactly.
is
Well, I have had a lot of experience in South America now. There are people down there doing some incredibly good work. A lot of it's partly because of dissemination. People don't want to either don't have access to Spanish language journals or they don't want to read them or they're not interested in. I mean, Santa Helena is a classic example in Brazil. This was first published in 2011, okay, in French. It was done by French people. 2011, it was published. It was totally ignored by North Americans. Didn't exist. Didn't exist at all. And I think that's partly North Americans' problem is that there has been some pretty good work done, and there's a lot of good work being done in Latin America. We're just either not aware of it, don't want to know about it, and can't take the time to even run it through Google Translate. Which is really great now. You can do Google Translate. It's not perfect, but you can run a whole article through there and get the good gist of it really quickly in any language. And I think that's part of the problem. Having seen a lot of this from the South American perspective, their archaeology as a profession is really 1970s, 1980s, and a lot of catching up to do. Highly influenced by North American archaeologists who look down on them, saying they're not doing good work. They get a sort of inferiority complex. This is my own experience and feeling. That's pretty much gone away now, luckily or happily, because of Betty Meggers and Cliff Evans and a number of other North Americans that said nonsense. And so I think there's going to be great things coming out of South America. There are now, and there's going to be a lot more. So I think that's partly just a matter of development and self-confidence, et cetera, et cetera. They're doing really good stuff down there.
yeah. Well, La Mendoza rock art is fascinating. You've got a plethora of extinct megafauna depicted, and that kind of is a bit of a game changer. That site became known and was published right as COVID was kicking off, and so I think it sort of got buried in the chaos, the social chaos
Yeah,
that
it
ensued.
has. But
Uh,
that to me, that's a really good and interesting site. That work was done partly by Jose Iriarte, who was a close colleague at Exeter,
yeah,
and his students, Mark, etc. Um, if you look at the rock art, it's fascinating stuff. But if you look at the associated artifacts, they look like Oldowan. I mean, there's no bifacial stuff. There's almost no retouch tools. This is that pre-Clovis, meaning not going to Clovis. It's the older than Clovis stuff that was in South America. It's all over the place. Um, and they didn't make bifaces. They didn't do any of that stuff. And yet, look at the rock art they were producing. There were people in the Americas that we have not recognized or we've been unwilling to recognize. Look at White Sands. You got these fantastic trackways and no associated artifacts. There were cultures, there were people in the Americas that didn't use stone tools. Simple as that.
yeah. Well, I mean, that was always the argument that I had heard and I've used many times, talking about sort of the archaeological invisibility of peoples in Asia. And the argument was that they were using bamboo. So who needed
Yes.
napstone tools when you had such a convenient, pliable source of, raw material? The on that particular topic, that's interesting. What do you think about Blaine Ensor's and Barbara Purdy's sort of? They're not arguing that these are Middle Paleolithic Lavawa tools that are here, but they're saying they were manufactured using very much the same technique. They're heavily patented. They look almost dead ringer for Mousterian tools, and I think Blaine Ensor did a terrific job showing that these assemblages are across the United States. They're not in great numbers, but they're present fairly widely.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be brought in on that particular project by Barbara. Looked at all the stone tools that they had. We had some real issues with context in a lot of it. She was very, very strongly convinced that there was something really early going on here. And I was there with Blaine as well at the same time. My sense of it, and we had a lot of different people, specialists come in and look at this stuff at the time, was something that Francois Bourd used to say all the time. He'd say, yes, but. And that's kind of the way I feel about that material. Yes, but. And when you start looking at things like Lavawa technology, which was my specialty, that was my dissertation, there's some resemblances, but it's pretty basic stuff. I can show you stuff that looks like that in Pueblo sites. Okay. That by itself isn't significant enough to really make the case that it's related somehow to Paleolithic. We've got Eric Boida that's down in Uruguay. He was last year, French archaeologist, works in Brazil mostly, looking for Lavawa stuff on these sites down in northern Uruguay, in Catalan Seco, where you have these big source sites that I've looked at extensively, never been touched by anybody, which is great. No archaeologists, no collectors, nobody. A lot of Lavawa looking stuff if you pick pieces out one at a time. Okay. Very little of it's in good archaeological context. It's all surface stuff. So I'm quite skeptical about this stuff without good context.
Okay.
And so I'm not saying it isn't real. I'm not saying that there couldn't be. I mean, I buy the Cerruti Mastodon site as good. That's 130,000 years ago.
I'm not familiar with that site. Where's that?
Well, it's in San Diego area.
Okay.
I can send you the article on it. Steve Holland did that with a bunch of paleontologists. It was summarily dismissed by archaeologists. But I think
but you go way back. You're willing to push back into.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that people settled the continent and stayed.
Right.
I mean, look at that. We've got new species of hominid that have been identified recently in China that we never knew about. Whole new lineages that we never knew about. We don't know everything. We haven't found everything. And so to just summarily reject something simply because it's older than what we can imagine doesn't make it not real. And I would argue that if you can stand back and dispassionately, objectively, as much as possible, we're all non-objective at some point, and just look at the evidence, if the Cerruti Mastodon site dated to 10,000 years ago, it probably wouldn't be questioned. If we had Parsons Island site in Beringia, nobody would question that was ancestral to Clovis. Location, location, location. And it's all about our assumptions. And one of the things I was always trying to get my students to understand, at least from my own bias and perspective, is archaeology is about evidence and using evidence outside of assumptions to let things happen. We're supposed to learn about the past through the evidence, not through our assumptions. Yeah. And this is where we've gone wrong with this whole issue of the peopling of the Americas. We assume they couldn't have come across the North Atlantic. And son of a gun, the evidence indicates there wasn't a ice-free corridor, so all of a sudden they came across the North Pacific along the ice. Well, how's that any different from North Atlantic?
Yeah.
We assume they couldn't have come from Europe. Why? We assume it because somehow or another it gets mixed up in politics, race, all this other kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it gets clouded, to your point, I do like the inductive approach, and we're not particularly good at that. But I love what you're putting forth here. That when you on this quest to answer the question, who were the first Americans? I think it's almost an impossible question, because it could be a very complex story of people's coming in, on the order of 130,000 years ago, perhaps leaving, perhaps dying out. Your sort of analog to the paleoanthropological um, modeling is interesting too, because indeed I was quite proficient. I was top of my class on in terms of human evolution, and that was 30 years ago, and everything has changed since then. So the paradigms do change, and actually they change, relatively speaking, fairly quickly as the evidence accumulates. I think they're a little more open-minded in paleoanthropology than we've been in the archaeology space, certainly relative to peopling of the New World. I do have another question for you. I'd like to get your thoughts on, and then a couple of final questions. Um,
Okay.
in Across Atlantic ice, you talk about skirting the ice flows, or the glaciers, whatever one of the ice caps. Um, there are some other theories that I think agree with the connection between Clovis and Solutrean, but they would argue for a more aggressive maritime um, approach, where it would be transoceanic, and perhaps something in watercraft more robust than skin boats, and that this was an intentional migration that brought over quite a number of people. Um, so that's it. I don't know that there's any particularly strong archaeological evidence to argue for that, other than really two things, which is that the number of people that came had to have been on a high enough order to develop, sustained population over a long period of time. And then the second would be with entry points into the Western Hemisphere that seem to suggest radiations coming in from, a Chesapeake in North America, but then somewhere around about, um, you know, Argentina, maybe near Buenos Aires, or Uruguay, in the southern hemisphere. How do you feel about some of those alternative models?
Yeah, I'm open-minded about that possibility. I think, it's been a real struggle for us in a lot of ways to even put across the concept that people could skirt the ice. We keep hearing, show us the boat, show us the boats. Of course, you can't show the boats for a lot of early stuff. We don't have any early boat evidence from Polynesia, Micronesia, or any of those places other than the indirect evidence that people got there. We don't have any archaeological evidence to show that. So, I'm like to think that I'm completely open to those concepts. Let's see the evidence. Let's see how it builds. Let's see if it becomes the most parsimonious explanation. I think we're going to see that for South America. Um, the sort of piling up of genetic evidence that we have Australasian populations there very early. It's pretty hard to run them all the way from the southern Southeast Asia all the way up across Beringia and all the way down the West Coast and into South America at 30,000 years ago, leaving no trace whatsoever. Zero. Okay. When they could do it on land. Now, yeah, you've got submerged landscapes on the West, but they're not that shallow along the West Coast until you get to Beringia. But I think that evidence is piling up. And what's going on in South America early is not what's going on in North America early. It's really different, significantly different. And We're talking 25, 30,000 years ago now. And that had to come from someplace. Unfortunately, right now, when I look at it, and some of my colleagues look at it, we see things like the Santa Elena assemblage, Pedro Ferrata, etc., that a lot of people reject. It looks, I think the case has been made for both of those very well. They don't look like anything anywhere in the world. I mean, they're not similar to anything else. So where'd it come from? How to get there? It's not just people trickling down from North America. Something else is going on. And so I am definitely of the opinion that yes, we're going to find out ultimately it was extremely complex. People came from many places at different times. Some of them were successful, some of them weren't. And populations die out all the time. And genetics is very, very important, but it's also a red herring right now. Our sample sizes are so small. And archaeologists that are associated with some of the geneticists are making these interpretations that just, I mean, Anzick is a good example. You've got one infant skeleton, and it wasn't even a skeleton, it's 4 pieces of the skeleton, found in who knows what context, because it was all dug up by a front end loader. It doesn't date the same time as the Clovis artifacts that came with it, although now they've made a statistical manipulation to the point where it might overlap. And that genetic evidence from that single infant skeleton has now been used to say this completely disproves the Solutrean hypothesis flat out. Wow. If I use one sample of anything in archaeology to come to a conclusion like that, I'd be thrown out of the profession today. Yeah. But no, yeah. The thing that's disheartening is people will say, oh, that proves it. Yeah. Good colleagues. That proves it. Anzick proves that it couldn't be Solutrean. Wow. Well, first of all, you can't even really make the case that it's a burial. You can't make a case that it's Clovis. If I did that in any other context, I'd be laughed out of the profession. But because it fits an agenda or perception, people just say, oh, okay, that proves it. And that's really disappointing because I like to think we're better scientists than that. And that's where a lot of genetics is from my point of view.
Yeah, no, we're not. You know, ego wraps into this as well. And people want to think that they're right. You know, you create this worldview and you fill in the gaps with whatever theories it is that are comfortable for your perspective. And then we cherry pick. And I'm as guilty as anybody. It's almost a human condition, and it's very hard to push back on that. But I like your vision for what you think we are going to see in the future. This real complex tapestry of human interaction in the Western Hemisphere, and there's just so much to learn. And when you look at, to your point, also the sampling biases are so obvious when you start work your way, and there's so many artifact samples that just sort of die at the U.S.-Mexican border.
Why don't you put up the second slide?
Yeah,
pull that one up. I put this in here for that very reason. This was a live science article that I got on the internet. It came to my feed the other day. It was, I think, a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and this is purported to somehow or another represent all of pre-Clovis, right? And the article, the author of that article cites a number of people, and again, it's the same people we always see cited about early. The one thing that's different here is they included some more recent stuff like Santa Elena and Chiquihuite. But you notice that Santa Elena and Chiquihuite are considered maybe not right. Okay, maybe the hole in that osteoderm is natural. Okay, maybe they aren't really artifacts at Chiquihuite. Well, who are they citing? Who makes those decisions about
Right.
what is legitimate and what isn't? We're talking about gatekeepers now,
Yeah, the
right?
gatekeepers.
So whoever wrote this article, and I thought they did a pretty good job, generally speaking, you notice there's no Parsons Island on there.
Yeah. Wow.
That's been published. It's out there for everybody to see.
Yeah.
And so you got, I listed a few of these sites here that have been published that aren't included in this article, or they're included but saying they're not good. So who's making these decisions? Who decided that that hole was natural? Show me the evidence. We
Yeah.
have to show the evidence to make our case. Why don't the critics show the evidence to make their case? That stuff is all available for people to study. Chicoite, they begged people to come to that place. Nobody went.
No, I think a
So,
lot of it is just
you know,
journalists in particular, have such a surface understanding of this, and they're just defaulting to whoever
you're
Google tells them
you're
is the
completely
authority.
breaking up. I can't hear you.
So, I just said that, journalists have such a most of them surface understanding of the topic, and they just default to whoever Google tells them the expert is. So in a way, it almost becomes, again, within the sort of tech world that we live in, whose profile and bio gets pinged first on the Google search. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
interesting.
And I can answer that question. That
Yeah.
question has to do with social media.
Yeah.
One of the people that gets constantly referred to, and I'm not going to say a name or anything, is somebody that's a social media influencer.
Okay.
That's what this person does. And so that person gets all kinds of coverage and legitimacy in their ideas.
Yeah.
Constantly. Yeah. And from what I can see, and had to deal with this issue before in this particular situation, that person who has very strongly criticized our hypothesis has never actually read our book. Okay?
Well, Bruce, that's why we're doing Underground, because we want
Thank
to
you.
give researchers an opportunity to ventilate and to share their idea without worry of sort of, I don't want to say without worry of criticism, but without being immediately skeptical and you have to have a forum for which to unabated share your data and your ideas, and I think I hopefully, and this is the sort of the one of the great values of podcasts is they're not censored, and they are out there to for anybody to see and listen to. So with a little luck, we'll get some good
Mike,
audience
I'll
here.
say one thing.
Yeah.
That in my own experience is I've been interviewed about this topic, you can imagine, many times by journalists. Every time I've been interviewed, I've told them to go to the critiques, the criticisms, the critiques. Go to those people, talk to those people. It doesn't work the other way around. I've never had a journalist come to me and say, such and such a person recommended they come and talk to me for my opinion. And I find that very interesting. Where are the journalists in this?
Yeah, right.
You're one of them.
It's a good
And
point.
you're out there just trying to figure it out.
No, it's journalism is dead. I'm afraid traditional journalism is gone. So
Yeah,
here
I'm
we
afraid
are.
so. The fourth estate is no longer exists.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you
Anyhow.
this. Let's say that
Okay.
a benevolent billionaire with an interest in peopling of the New World listens to this podcast and says, "Gosh, Bruce has just terrific things to say and great ideas, and I'd love to fund him to do something." What do you do?
First of all, I'd say I don't do it. But what's desperately needed is the continental shelf. the work on the continental shelf on the east coast of North America. Sinmar, we haven't got around to talking about, fair enough. We can't do everything. The evidence for Sinmar is so strong, and it would be really easy to go out there and deal with that, except it's expensive. Darren Lowry had a proposal to NOAA, very good proposal to NOAA. We had within probably weeks of the opportunity to get out there on that continental shelf and reinvestigate that location. We got the side scanning sonar that shows the drag marks, shows the hang, which is probably the Mastodon. We don't know. It could be a World War II submarine torpedo. We don't know what it is. But we had access to it. We had the funding. We had the ROVE, the remote operated vehicle, the submarine to go down to it. We were just waiting for the weather to clear. That was in 2015. Hey, excuse me, could you be quiet, please? Thank you. That was in 2015. We were perched, ready to go. We had the money, everything. The ROVE was being donated by a federal agency. An article came out saying that the Sinmar was made up, that we didn't have real evidence, that we were faking it, and that ROVE was withdrawn within a day.
Whoa! I remember when you were going through that
back out.
But I did not know that that was what had happened. That is ridiculous.
Yep. It was the federal agency, the director, I can't remember the exact agency. It had to do with preservation on the continental shelf. It wasn't NOAA. That had offered us the ROVE, withdrew it, just like that. And it was very coincidental that it's happened within a few days of when the article came out. So somebody made the director aware of the article and influenced that. So we didn't get out there again. So,
oh my God.
Not only is there criticism our approach, there's intentional efforts to stop research. Figure that one out.
And that's a borderline conspiracy right there, Bruce.
Yeah.
What the heck?
Yeah. Never mind that the article should never have been published because it was libelous article. Anyhow, so your question is, where should we go? Well, I think the continental shelf is the first place. Lots and lots of money. I mean, that proposal to go out there and do the real job on Sinmar was over $300,000. At that time, a boat, just the boat, the research boat, nothing else, was $16,000 a day.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at 80 meters, 240 feet that can barely be dove. You can't dive it, really, for more than a few minutes. So you've got to use remote vehicles. There's a lot of equipment that's necessary, a lot of expertise. And the other thing that I would say that would support that option, looking at the continental shelf in great detail, is there's a huge amount of Native American interest in what was going on that continental shelf that they feel very strongly is not being protected well. And they have a lot, and I'm using a generality here, Native American. But indigenous peoples, especially in northeastern United States, have stories, and stories are the wrong term, histories of their people being out there. And they want to know about it. So investigating the continental shelf, really, and putting some investment into that, would not only satisfy archaeological curiosity, it would help indigenous groups to reconstruct their own histories. So that I think one can make the strongest case for that particular approach, which would involve cooperative partnerships between sciences and traditionalists. And I would think that would be very, very attractive to some donors.
Yeah.
And I could help put it together.
And you've already got the proposal written. I've seen it. So good. Just so folks know that we're talking about in the Chesapeake, 240 feet down, back in the 70s.
Off the Chesapeake, not the Chesapeake. It's really important. It's not the Chesapeake. It's the continental shelf.
It's on the shelf outside, off the Chesapeake, right?
57 miles out.
Okay. Sorry, I'd forgotten that, but indeed it is. So it's on the shelf, and what looks like a laurel leaf point was found. Well, here's the image of it. It's on the cover of your book.
Yeah.
Um, and there is a what looks like a maybe a bone trap or some sort of depression that has collected materials. It may just well be a semi-intact kill site. But
Yes.
I think the argument of going back out there, seeing what other materials might be found. There could be great dates to be found. There could be additional points. It could be another Parsons Island type site. So if anybody's out there interested in supporting this work, I would say buy Bruce's book and consider throwing some tax deductible cash at the nonprofit that he works with to go out and take a look at the Sinmar site and invite me along, please. That would be a lot of fun. Anything else you want to add, Bruce?
Oh no, this kind of discussion can go on for weeks. So, Mike, I really appreciate having this forum to put forth some of these issues. I hope it stimulates a lot of interest, and please, good constructive critique is always welcome. Don't get the idea that we don't want to have critique. We put out a hypothesis that needs a lot of testing. We made assertions that haven't been well tested. They need testing. Some people have done that. It hasn't been done. So, we're not trying to say we know what the history was. We're putting out ideas with backing that need more work, a lot more work. And if people can come up with alternatives with evidence using the same criteria, more power to them. I mean, I don't think we have the truth. I think we have a good idea. And so I'd like to wrap it up with that. We've always, Dennis and I, of course, Dennis is gone now, but we've always said, first of all, we weren't talking about Europeans in our work. We were not talking about the first Americans, even though the press always likes to use that. We're just talking about an episode in the history of humankind that we think has some validity. That's where we're coming from.
And well said. So, on that note, thank you, Bruce Bradley, so much for your time. This was a fascinating discussion. And I'd encourage all the listeners to ponder the implications and spread the word, and certainly stay tuned for the next episode of Underground. And we'll see you next time.
Okay. Well,
Thanks.
and Mike, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Truly. Okay. Take care. Bye, everybody.